Hi guys, if you've been following along with our recent blog posts, you'll know that we've been spending quite a lot of time talking about strength. Obviously strength development is a real big thing in CrossFit, Olympic weightlifting, most sports really, plays a big factor in your performance, all right? Particularly in a sport like CrossFit where strength is one of the key factors in performance, okay? So obviously last time we spoke a little bit about the difference between strength and power and the different types of strength. This time we're having a look at the actual adaptations that occur when you take part in strength training, okay? So we're looking at the moment, or in this episode, we're looking at the actual physiological adaptation. So what actually happens within your muscles as a result of strength training, which then lead to increased lifts, all right? Say in the form of 1 rep maxes, whatever, okay? So first thing we're looking at, obviously, which if you think back to GCSE, you'll know a little bit about this already, muscle fiber type. Okay, so you have the 3 main types, type 1, type 2A, type 2B. Obviously each of those, well, it's argued each of those can be developed, but obviously how or the way they're developed is dependent on the kind of strength training you're doing. Okay, so I'm sure some of you'll know type 1 fibers, really they're only really much use when it comes to strength endurance. Okay, so it might be obviously like longer runs, bike rides, all that kind of stuff where you're going to be working a continual pace, okay, so kind of like a medium average pace for a long period of time. So in terms of developing your 1 rep maxes, you don't really want to develop those too much, okay, so obviously your training is going to reflect that. You're not going to be doing sets of kind of 20, 30 reps if we're looking to develop your maximal strength, okay. Type 2A fibers, these tend to be the ones which are the most adaptable, okay, so when you do strength training, it tends to be that type 1 fibers become more like type 2A as opposed to type 2B, okay, so they're kind of like a real good middle ground between, you're not going to produce your maximal amount of force if you have predominantly type 2A fibers, but they also mean that you can perform slightly higher reps, so you might be doing like kind of sets of 5 to 8, all right, not as high as your type 1 fibers, whereas type 2B fibers is really going to come into play when you're only doing single maximal sets. Okay, obviously for 1 rep max, that is what we're doing, but the adaptability of type 2 fibers is a lot lower than type 2A fibers, okay? Obviously the force characteristics are slightly different, which means the training methods are slightly different for each one. Okay, so to develop your type 2 fibers, really, you're going to be looking at your kind of hypertrophy training, your relatively low rep range, kind of 3 reps all the way up to 8 reps, and that's going to cause the biggest adaptations in type 2A fibers. Okay, type 2B fibers, you're looking at your single reps, but even then, okay, those adaptations could be more neurological as opposed to physiological. Okay, so just because you're doing that kind of training doesn't mean you're going to develop your type 2B fibers, which tends to be why we focus on your type 2A fibers. All right, the chance of success is a lot higher. Okay, and obviously by developing your type 2A fibers, it's still going to help you improve your 1 rep maxes. All right, so aside from that, also another factor which can impact, or another physiological adaptation of strength training, is your muscle cross-sectional area. Okay, so simply this is the individual fiber size of the muscle fibers within a muscle. All right, so if you're taking your bicep, for example, how big each of those fibers are is going to have an impact on how much force you can produce, and it's also going to change if you're taking part in strength training. Okay, generally to develop your muscle cross-sectional area, hypertrophy training tends to be the best thing to do because of the stimulus, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, because of the stimulus that comes from hypertrophy training. It leads to increases in size in each individual muscle fiber. Okay, the way that size is increased, again, depends on what kind of training you're doing. Obviously that can be from fuel stored in the muscle, which makes it appear bigger, but really what we want is the actual muscle fiber itself to increase in size, and that's going to lead to improvements in strength. Okay, and then the third factor, all right, which can happen, or which we want to happen as a result of strength training, okay, is this thing called angle of pennation. Okay, so the angle of pennation is all about how your muscle fibers are arranged within, obviously, the muscle itself. Okay, so obviously each muscle contains hundreds of muscle fibers, and the arrangement of those can have a big impact on how much force that muscle can produce. Again, it's something which can be impacted by the type of training you're doing. Okay, so generally we have 2 kinds of arrangement or two angles of pennation which can occur within the muscle. Okay, so the first one is in series. All right, and I apologize for the terrible drawing, but in series basically means that each fiber is arranged in a line. Okay, think of it like train carriages. Okay, you've got one, then you've got the bridges, and then you've got another one, and so on. Okay, obviously this means that the way those muscles pull, or the amount of the number of muscle fibers that are pulling on a joint is a lot less, which then means that, as you'd expect, you're then going to produce less force from that movement. Okay, in parallel is a little bit different. Okay, so as opposed to the muscle fibers being arranged in a straight line, they're arranged in these diagonal lines. Okay, which means obviously that arrangement, if you think about that, for example, around your knee, if you have lots of muscle fibers coming in at an angle, okay, then you're going to have more individual muscle fibers pulling on the joint. Okay, and when we talk about neurological factors next time, and how the co-activation of muscle fibers can make a difference, obviously, to how much force you can produce, having muscle fibers in parallel arrangement as opposed to in series arrangement, again, obviously, is going to make a big difference. It's going to help you produce more force. Okay, and again, this is something which can change as a result of strength training. Okay, so as you can see, there's kind of three main physiological adaptations that occur following strength training. We're going to talk about neurological adaptations next, and then we're going to explore some of the training methods we might use to elicit these adaptations that we've talked about here. Okay, each one is going to be slightly different. All right, so stay tuned for the next blog post.